We usually think of democracy like a physical building. You have the foundation, which is the Constitution. You have these big load-bearing walls, the courts, the legislature, a free press. But there's this one piece of the architecture that is completely invisible to you.
Right, you don't even see it.
Exactly. It functions a lot like gravity. You don't even notice it's there, holding everything together until the exact second it just stops working. And then, suddenly everything starts floating away into complete chaos. I'm talking, of course, about the peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah, it really is the single moment of maximum vulnerability for any system of government. You have this incredibly delicate, highly perilous window between the old administration leaving and the new one coming in. And historically, that's the exact moment when regimes just collapse.
And what happens when that core ritual breaks down is the entire focus of our deep dive today. Okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at a fascinating new paper by Dr. Baidya from the Takshila Foundation, and it's titled Defense of Democracy: When the Constitution Must Protect Itself. And the core premise here is a bit of a paradigm shift.
It really is. We tend to operate under this assumption that democracy is tested at the ballot box, right? That the ultimate stress test is the election itself.
Yeah, the actual voting part.
Exactly. But Dr. Baidya argues the true test has almost nothing to do with voting. The actual test is whether the people who lose power accept the mathematical reality of their defeat. Because without that acceptance, the voting is just theater.
Which is such a striking way to put it.
Yeah.
Now, before we really jump into the details here, I want to take a quick second to make something super clear to you, the listener. The source material we're covering today dives into some highly charged, real-world political situations.
Very recent ones, too.
Right. It talks about left-wing figures like Mamata Banerjee in India and right-wing figures like Donald Trump in the U.S. And I want to explicitly state that this deep dive takes absolutely no sides. We are not endorsing any political viewpoints here. We're strictly imparting the factual claims and the legal constitutional arguments that are presented in the source text.
Yeah, we're just looking at the mechanics of the law. And the author looks at this through the lens of constitutional mechanics to identify this modern global pattern. We're increasingly seeing political actors who are perfectly happy to use the democratic system to get power. But the moment that same system tries to remove them from power, they just reject the architecture entirely.
So to illustrate this, the paper dives into two massive case studies. Let's start with the West Bengal Assembly elections from May 2026. The source cites reporting from Reuters and the Times of India covering what became a pretty severe constitutional standoff. So the ruling party, the Trinamool Congress, dropped dramatically from 215 seats all the way down to 80.
That's a massive drop.
Huge. Well, the BJP took over 2/3 of the assembly. And the chief minister, Mamata Banerjee, actually lost her own constituency. But instead of conceding, she just refused to resign.
Right, and she claimed around 100 seats were, quote, forcibly taken, and pointed to electronic voting machines having unusually high battery levels.
Yeah, she called it a moral victory. But the text points out she did all of this without providing any public, verifiable evidence for those claims.
And that's where the constitutional crisis really stems from. Her refusal to step down wasn't just, a rhetorical flourish or a quiet protest. The post-election atmosphere got so incredibly volatile that the Election Commission actually had to order continuous armed patrolling across the entire state just to handle the threats of vandalism and violence.
Wow. And then Dr. Baidya pairs this directly with the United States in 2020 and 2021. So Donald Trump's refusal to accept his election defeat, which obviously culminated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol.
Right. The text references the January 6th Select Committee's final report for this. And they pointed out that this was the very first time in American history that a sitting president actively refused his constitutional duty to facilitate a peaceful transfer.
So the author is taking these two totally geographically, legally, and politically distinct events. You have a left-wing state government in India and a right-wing federal government in the U.S. and extracting the common denominator here.
What's fascinating here is how the author defines that common denominator. It's the shift from a lawful challenge to what the paper terms constitutional hostage-taking. And it's vital to understand the distinction Dr. Baidya makes, because they're not the same thing.
Right, because filing petitions or demanding recounts, that's totally normal.
Exactly. Peaceful protests, bringing evidence to an appellate court, all of that is entirely lawful. It actually validates the system. It's totally healthy for a defeated party to use the legal mechanisms that are available to them.
Yeah, it's like if you think the referee made a bad call, you ask for an instant replay. That's just playing a strong defense. But constitutional hostage-taking is something entirely different. The way I think about it, imagine you're playing a really complex, high-stakes board game with your friends.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You play for hours, everybody knows the rules. But when the final points are tallied, the losing player doesn't ask to recount the points. They just flip the physical board over, scatter all the pieces across the room, and yell that the rule book was entirely fabricated.
That is a perfect analogy
Yeah.
because politically, the loser flips the board because it shifts the public's focus completely away from the actual score and onto the chaos of the messy room.
Right, and it forces the winner into this weird false negotiation just to clean up the pieces.
That captures the psychological tactic perfectly. When a defeated party refuses to vacate office, declares the entire election illegitimate without evidence, and leverages state machinery or incites violence to delay the transition, they aren't challenging the score anymore. They're actively trying to destroy the board game.
And the danger there is that if a ruling party can just stay in power by declaring the election illegitimate, then the people's mandate ceases to be a mandate. It basically becomes a conditional suggestion that only counts if the loser graciously agrees to accept it.
Exactly. Which brings us to a really difficult question. If a sitting leader decides to just flip the board, how is a piece of paper constitution actually supposed to stop them?
Right. It's just words on a page.
Yeah. And this is where the paper introduces the legal framework of defensive democracy. The foundational principle here is essentially the paradox of tolerance. The text specifically states, democracy must protect dissent, but it must not protect organized constitutional sabotage.
And to show that this isn't just, academic theory, the author points to what they call the global gold standard of defensive democracy, which is the German Basic Law.
Specifically, Article 21, Section 2. The German Constitution explicitly allows for political parties to be declared unconstitutional and entirely banned if they seek to undermine the free democratic order.
Okay, wait. I have to push back here. Isn't banning a political party inherently anti-democratic? I mean, if we're trying to save pluralism and democracy, doesn't dissolving your political opponents just instantly turn you into the exact authoritarian regime you're trying to prevent?
This raises an important question, and it's the central tension of the entire concept. But the text addresses this head-on by looking at how the German model actually operates in practice. It is not a casual political weapon.
Like, the chancellor can't just do it on a whim.
Exactly. The chancellor can't just wake up, decide the opposition is getting a little too popular for comfort, and sign an executive order to delete them. Under the German model, the executive branch does not have the power to ban a party at all. Only the Federal Constitutional Court can make that determination.
Okay, so it's removed from the political arena and placed strictly in the judicial arena.
Right. It requires a rigorous, independent judicial process. The court demands concrete, undeniable evidence that a party's internal aims or external conduct are actively seeking to abolish the free democratic basic order. It is an exceptional, extreme measure.
And the text points out this isn't just an isolated German court, right? They cite the Venice Commission.
Yes, the Venice Commission, which is the Council of Europe's advisory body on constitutional matters. And they affirm that party dissolution is a legitimate and sometimes necessary measure as long as it is backed by strict due process and adjudicated by an independent judiciary, not a partisan legislature.
So the whole design is about creating this deliberate friction. The Constitution has to be muscular enough to actually defend itself from sabotage, but constrained enough through independent judges and super high burdens of proof to prevent a ruling party from just abusing the power.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Germany's system relies on having a court that is explicitly constitutionally empowered to hit that undo button. What happens when a constitution lacks that specific tool?
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that is exactly the massive vulnerability Dr. Baidya identifies when analyzing India and the United States. Both of these massive democracies ask their leaders to swear an oath, but neither seems to have a clear pre-existing mechanism if the party just decides to cross its fingers behind its back.
Yeah, they both have incredibly strong democratic principles, but they lack clear, actionable mechanisms to enforce them after the election. If we look at India first, the Constitution is very clear. Article 164 establishes that the Chief Minister is not a sovereign ruler. Their authority is fundamentally responsible to the Legislative Assembly.
Right.
Furthermore, under Section 29A of the Representation of the People Act, Any political party seeking official registration has to sign a memorandum declaring true faith and allegiance to the principles of socialism, secularism, and democracy.
They essentially have to swear a blood oath to the rules of the game just to get their piece on the board. But despite making them swear that oath, the author points out this glaring blind spot.
Yeah, the text highlights a landmark 2002 Supreme Court case in India, Indian National Congress of the Institute of Social Welfare. In that ruling, the Supreme Court determined that the Election Commission does not actually have the power to deregister a political party except in incredibly narrow technical situations.
Like what?
Like if the party committed outright forgery when they initially filed their registration paperwork. The mechanical problem there is that the Election Commission is an administrative and regulatory body. They can discipline individual candidates during a campaign. They can monitor spending.
But they can't kick a party out.
Right. The court ruled they do not possess the sweeping judicial authority required to dissolve a major political party for post-election constitutional sabotage. So the Election Commission can grant the license to drive, but they have virtually no legal mechanism to revoke that license when the party deliberately drives the car into a crowd of pedestrians.
Wow. And the United States is dealing with a surprisingly similar architectural flaw, right? The text examines Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
Yes, the famous disqualification clause.
Right, written right after the Civil War, explicitly designed to bar officials who engage in insurrection or rebellion from holding office. I mean, it is the ultimate defensive democracy tool, literally written into the U.S. Constitution. But, as the paper details, the enforcement mechanism was essentially broken.
We saw this play out in real time with the 2024 Supreme Court case, Trump v. Anderson. The Supreme Court ruled that individual states could not unilaterally enforce Section 3 against federal candidates.
And the logic behind that ruling is crucial for us to understand here, because if individual states had the power to disqualify federal candidates, you would instantly end up with a totally chaotic, fractured electoral map.
Oh, absolutely. A candidate might be deemed an insurrectionist and removed from the ballot in Colorado, but remain perfectly legal on the ballot in Wyoming, based entirely on different state-level judges interpreting the law differently.
Right, which would be a nightmare.
Precisely. So the Supreme Court concluded that enforcing this kind of national disqualification requires federal authority, specifically congressional legislation outlining exactly how the 14th Amendment should be applied.
But Congress was politically paralyzed.
Yes, they had never passed that specific modern enforcement legislation. So the constitutional tool was rendered inert. The law existed on paper, but the handle to actually wield it was missing.
So in both India and the U.S., you have these beautifully written constitutional principles, but a total loss of mechanical deterrence. So what does this all mean for the voters? Without a predefined constitutional punishment, the risk-reward calculation for a defeated leader completely flips.
It really does.
I mean, think about it. If you are a leader who just lost an election, and you know the absolute worst thing that can happen to you for refusing to leave is just, what, a bunch of angry op-eds and some public criticism, why wouldn't you flip the board?
Exactly. The author argues that without a clear pre-existing mechanism, deterrence weakens. If there is no fear of party-level consequences, defeated leaders will calculate that the political benefits of resisting energizing their most extreme supporters, raising massive amounts of money, preserving their grip on their party, those benefits massively outweigh the non-existent legal risks.
So when the only punishment for constitutional sabotage is public disapproval, the anti-democratic gamble is actually a highly rational choice for a power-hungry leader.
It's terrifying, but it's true, which is why the paper transitions from merely diagnosing these gaps to proposing an actual structural cure. They call it the doctrine of democratic forfeiture.
Right. This is Dr. Baidya's proposed constitutional amendment. And the standard is pretty straightforward. A political party that uses the democratic process to gain power, but actively rejects the democratic process after losing power, legally forfeits its claim to full democratic protection.
But the author is very careful here to avoid the trap we discussed earlier regarding authoritarian abuse.
Right, the whole dictatorship problem.
Exactly. The doctrine of democratic forfeiture is not a trap door where a party instantly ceases to exist the moment they complain about a ballot. It is built on a highly calibrated system of graduated sanctions. It outlines 6 specific levels of escalating consequences, ensuring the punishment is strictly proportionate to the sabotage.
It functions exactly like a referee managing a volatile soccer match. You don't hand out a red card and eject a player just because they argued with a line judge, right? You manage the escalation. Under this doctrine, level 1 is just a formal constitutional warning and public censure from a high court.
Right, a yellow card.
Yeah. But if the party continues to defy the transition, level 2 introduces targeted financial and administrative penalties, like stripping them of tax-exempt status or state funding.
And then level 3 is where it becomes severely debilitating. It involves freezing the party's recognized status or their election symbol. To understand the gravity of this, especially in a country like India, election symbols like a lotus flower or a hand are the primary way millions of voters visually identify their party on the voting machine.
Oh, wow. So freezing that symbol severs the party's entire historical brand identity.
Exactly. It's a
Yeah.
huge blow. Then level 4 disqualifies the specific responsible leaders from holding office. Level 5 suspends the party's registration entirely, and only at the very end, at level 6, the absolute nuclear option, do you see full deregistration and dissolution of the party as a legal entity.
And returning to the safeguards, the crucial element of this doctrine is who actually wields the whistle. The executive branch cannot initiate these sanctions. It must be decided by a constitutional court or a specially appointed politically independent election tribunal.
Right, and the standard of proof is elevated. It requires clear and convincing evidence of organized sabotage, not just partisan accusations or heated campaign rhetoric.
But here's my question. Looking at this framework, why place so much emphasis on punishing the entire political party? If we stick to the soccer metaphor, why freeze the whole team's funding and suspend their logo if just the team captain is the one throwing a tantrum and refusing to leave the field? Why not just surgically disqualify the individual leader and leave the party alone?
That is perhaps the most insightful argument in the whole paper. Dr. Baidya points out that modern political sabotage is rarely a solo act. Political parties are sophisticated organizations that act through coordinated messaging and logistical networks.
Okay, that makes sense.
Think about the mechanics of defiance. A supreme leader gives a speech rejecting the election results. Immediately, the party's regional office bearers amplify that claim on television. Their ground cadres mobilize to block roads or protest. The party's legal wing files dozens of frivolous lawsuits to delay the certification. The entire party machinery enables and benefits from that orchestrated disorder.
So the party apparatus can't just play innocent. They can't act as a megaphone for the leader's chaos, and then when the courts step in, just shrug and say, hey, we can't control him, that's just his personal opinion.
Exactly. That is what the author calls organizational evasion. If you only punish the individual leader, the party simply replaces them with a loyal proxy and continues the exact same anti-democratic behavior without missing a single beat.
Wow, yeah.
But by putting the entire party's legal existence, their funding, and their public privileges at risk, you completely change the internal incentive structure. Deterrence suddenly operates inside the party.
Because their survival is on the line.
Right. When the internal power brokers and the financial backers realize, wait a minute, our entire organizational survival is on the line because of this leader's actions, they are financially and politically forced to rein in their own rogue elements. A party is rewarded by collective power when they win. The paper argues they must face collective legal responsibility when they attempt to break the system.
It essentially shifts the burden of discipline from the courts back onto the political parties themselves.
Yes, Cicely.
We have covered a massive amount of constitutional theory today. We examined how the stark refusal to concede, highlighted by the intense standoffs in West Bengal and the U.S. Capitol, exposes a critical architectural vulnerability in modern governance.
We explored the paradox of defensive democracy through the German model, proving that constitutions can theoretically wield the power to protect themselves from internal sabotage.
We unpacked the specific legal gaps in India and the U.S. that allowed defeated leaders to just flip the board without consequence. And finally, we looked at the doctrine of democratic forfeiture, that escalating six-step alarm system designed to force political parties to respect the transition of power or risk their very existence.
The overriding lesson here is that the peaceful transfer of power cannot simply rely on polite political traditions or the personal decency of candidates. It has to be codified. It is the absolute heartbeat of the democratic system, and when it stops, the system fails.
And imagine watching an election roll in with that context. This matters because if a defeated ruler gets to unilaterally decide whether your vote was valid, your mandate as a citizen isn't actually a mandate. Your power is entirely conditional on the grace of the person you just fired.
It's a chilling thought.
It really is. But I want to leave you with one final, slightly maddening thought to mull over. Dr. Baidya strongly argues that democracies need to proactively pass these defensive constitutional amendments before the next major crisis hits. But think about the mechanics of how laws are passed. To ratify a constitutional amendment, you have to rely on the votes of the very politicians who are currently sitting in power.
Right.
So, if the concept of defensive democracy requires the current ruling class to legislate severe existential penalties against their own parties for the day they inevitably lose an election, how on earth does a society convince its most powerful leaders to install the very security system that is designed to one day lock them out of the building?
That is the million-dollar question.
It's the ultimate test of political selflessness. Think about who guards the guards next time you're waiting to see if gravity still works. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we will see you next time.